You unlock this benefit with the key of Patreon. Beyond is another dimension. A dimension of thought. A dimension of speculation. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both waffle and substance. Of things and ideas. You've just crossed into the podcast zone.
We are going to have a hell where we're just forced to podcast endlessly.
yeah.
And everybody loves the podcast.
Yes.
We've got a million listeners, and they just are demanding more episodes, and we're so unhappy.
But it's only about bad films. We can only talk about bad films. Right. Next one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for trekking through the Twilight Zone. And we are going to be talking about some really bad childhood trauma in this next episode. And to join me in psychoanalyzing this poor woman's trauma is Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
I'm okay, but I'm just a projection of my older future self, which you haven't met yet.
No, it's all very complicated. We are going to be talking about Nightmare as a Child, an episode in which a woman has returned home to her home city and started work as a teacher. And then one evening she comes across a small child sat on the stairs outside her apartment. The child seems to know more about her than the kid should know. And then when she disappears, a gentleman enters the building and starts to relay potential information about her mother's death way back when she was a child. So, Julian, what did you think about this episode?
Well, it's strange because I didn't really like this episode. And yet it's much more controlled than other episodes, right? I mean, like if you're going to ask for a controlled episode that, doesn't really involve the supernatural. I mean, it involves a sort of like Fight Club, unrealistic sort of hallucination. But outside of that, there's no angels, there's no magic, there's no aliens landing. I mean, it could have gone any of those directions, but doesn't. It's really about trauma. So, I mean, in a sense, it's a better made story, and yet it doesn't really move me. What about you?
There's something about this episode I really like, and I think it's as you say, it's the ambition. I applaud what they're trying to do with this episode, and because it's dark. Like this episode is dark. Like we've watched, we've talked about in the last episode, we were talking about a two-dimensional sort of silly crook, bobbing around in Liberace's bathroom. This one goes straight for the kill. This one is about suppressing traumatic events, killers that have never, people that have never been caught for murder, like some really sort of traumatic stuff in this. You say there's no supernatural element. Again, you can play this. You give this the Fight Club angle. Like the little girl that she speaks to is never actually there, and it's just this representation. It's her mind reaching out to her, and I like that it does that. Like she interacts with this thing, and she sort of calls herself Marky, and she has it. It's but again, we talked about that with with I think the Big Tall Wish. This idea of if this was 15 minutes longer. If this was given room to breathe, you could really do some more with it. Because I feel that this gets rushed. The ending gets incredibly rushed, and that's where it sort of falls down a little bit. But I really like this idea of how it sort of starts to come to her, and she starts to talk to certain people about this idea of the kid. I also want to talk about, and we'll get to it, the adult, the I forget the character's name, but the older gentleman who did kill her mother. There are several lines that he says that really made me uncomfortable.
Selden, I guess, is Peter Selden is the murderer.
Yeah.
What were those lines?
So there's the fact that he was given a photo of her as a little girl, and still has it in his wallet. That sort of creeped me out to begin with. He then sort of keeps saying how beautiful she was. But one of the first things he says to her, because I was confused about their age, and we've seen other episodes, and obviously it was a fine thing around this age where there'd be an age gap between a bride and a groom sort of thing. husband and wife. But he says how he had such a crush on her.
Yeah.
And I was like, hang on, what's the age difference supposed to be here? And then it shows that he's still got this picture of her as a little girl in his wallet. And I was like, are we dealing with paedophilia in 1961? Like, is this? Am I getting all Jimmy Savile vibes of this, or have I read this completely wrong?
No, I think you're right. And he's also been stalking her.
Yeah.
I mean, that's essentially why he shows up. I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. He's so weird. I don't understand why he is stalking her. Ostensibly, the point is that he's scared that one day she will remember the murder. So just kill her.
Yeah, well, I think it's more. I think it's the fact that she left town after the events. Like she left town, and her returning. She says she's been there for several months, almost a year. And I think he's been following her for that very reason. Like, oh my God, is her coming back to town going to trigger these memories? However, I think that, again, this is why I think a bigger episode would have worked. Because I always get the feeling like he's been following her, but in following her, he's sort of still, I don't want to say got feelings for her, but there's still something there. Like, he's reluctant to engage her on that sort of, like, you know, to protect himself. He tries to sort of, like, because he actually admits it. He confesses to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, what response are you looking for? Like, forgiveness? I don't know.
I don't know that either. I mean, I find that very inscrutable. I also find Helen inscrutable. I mean, we're supposed to believe that she was burned. She had this incident when she was burned. She saw her mother being strangled, right? I mean, this is a very intimate,
brutal,
horrible act, and repressed it, right? So she has this trauma, but she tells the kid, yeah, of course she remembers how she got burned, but then says, well, come to think of it, I don't. Well, either you do or you don't.
I took that as being dismissive, as like, oh, yeah, of course I know how it's got. And then she's sort of like, well, all right, well, no, actually, I don't. Like, you know, because the kid presses her, and she's like, she's almost like, all right, look, I don't really remember. You know, it's that sort of
not to get. I don't want to get into it.
Yeah, it's almost being dismissive of, like, you know, like, I'm trying to shut you up, and so I'm going to sort of tell you whatever you want to hear. But she clearly doesn't remember, or has repressed those memories.
But I mean, how does she not? Okay, so right. I mean, there's definitely some memory repression going on. How does she not remember that she had the nickname Marky as a child? When you see yourself as, I mean, remember, she doesn't even know what she looked like as a child, right?
Yeah, it goes too far. That's the thing. It does definitely go too far. It definitely goes. This to me, I'll get to a second, because you're right. It goes too far. Like, I can still remember. You know, I've never had this level of trauma, but even if you do have that level, I can understand repressing that trauma, but you don't repress everything else that happened around that. You know, you don't forget your entire childhood. That's ridiculous. It goes too far in that respect. And that's why, like, towards the end, I was hoping for some sort of supernatural intervention. I was like, oh, there's going to be something else. And again, I brought up Stephen King on a previous episode recently. I'm bringing it up again. Is that, like, I was thinking of It. And you have this thing of, like, when they're kids, they fight Pennywise, and then when they all grow up and they have to come back to Derry, they've forgotten all these things.
And then they fight Pound Foolish.
Yeah, yeah. But when the thing is, they've forgotten these things, but that has like a supernatural intent. Like, there's this whole thing about they're supposed to forget because there's this interdimensional being that's infected them. None of that here, and so it feels like, well, I was hoping for something. I was hoping that when you got to see that I was hoping that child wasn't just a Tyler Durden. I was hoping it would be a supernatural entity to explain some of this. And when it doesn't, that's what I mean. Now, the ending is weak. Like, she gets to come up. Like, the ending's fine in the sense of he gets what he needs, but, like, I don't know. There's the explanation for the memory loss and the repression never really plays out. Even the police seem fine with it.
Yes. Yeah, the police are just like, oh yeah, She said that she saw this kid, and like she's what I like about that though is that she's told the truth to the police, and it is so often in TV and movies where you go through some weird event of aliens or the supernatural, and then at the end the police get involved because somebody's dead or whatever, and nobody ever tells the police the truth.
Yeah.
And I always think, come on, you're not going to be able to hide, all of this. Tell them the truth. Most of us would, maybe shade how many ghosts were involved or whatever. But I mean, so often in these kinds of shows, they, it's like, oh, she said she didn't know who he was and he just came in and tripped down the stairs. You get that dumb line where it's like, yeah, I don't think the cops would buy that. And why wouldn't you tell the truth? So I do like that, even though, yeah, you're right. I mean, the cops seem pretty blithe the other way.
Yeah, well, there's nothing like, oh, she's a nutty broad or anything like that. Like, it's just accepted. Oh, she saw a younger version of herself. But they even seem to accept her story because they say she's lucky. Oh, that's lucky that she saw this younger version of herself because she was almost the victim of a homicide. And you're like, how have you, like, there's no other witnesses, so you are blindly taking this woman's word about all this. And it does seem too neat at the end. You almost need a third person. This is the thing. You need a second witness to the confession. Just for the policing at the end, like someone else to go, no, he came in and confessed to her mother's murder, then attacked her, and he fell down the stairs. Like, that backup. Otherwise, it's like, okay, this is all very suspicious, but it rounds out way too neatly. But I still love the concept. I was still really impressed that they went there with this idea.
Well, I like the concept of trauma. I like the concept of dealing with trauma. But you said the ending is too neat with the police, and you're right, because I mean they seem to believe that this man who's dead was apparently the murderer of her mother all those years ago. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, except, a woman who may or may not have, I mean, she did push him down the stairs. But I think the ending with trauma is also too pat, right? I mean, and that's the closing narration. Miss Helen Foley, who took a dark spot from the tapestry of her life and rubbed it clean. No, she didn't. Yeah. She still got the burn. You still, I remember my mom being strangled, just in the room with me, basically, when I was a kid. There's no, like, oh, so I finally met the murderer and now he's dead. Oh, well, that's, throw the salt over your shoulder. I'm done with that. On to being a school teacher. I'm so happy now.
A better exit thing would have been, what was her name? Helen
Foley.
Yeah, so Helen Foley, a woman who found repressed memories and is now going to deal with a lifetime of therapy in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, that's right. And I like stories where somebody meets their future self or their past self, and if it's time travel or hallucination. I mean, I often think about wanting to do justice to my childhood self, and what I would feel like if I met my childhood self and what I would tell him. And some of it's good and some of it's bad. But I think that I feel a kind of accountability to that. So I like these stories, but weirdly, this is like one of the least satisfying versions of that I've ever seen, if that makes sense. I think you like this more than I did.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. I think I'm more. It isn't. I agree. It's not. The ending's not satisfying. I think I'm more applauding the sort of the intent, and I think the first half of the episode with the whole, and also up until everybody confesses, is dark and interesting, and the fact they did this on a sort of a weekly primetime TV show is pretty gutsy. So I think I'm buying into it from that perspective. But yeah, no, it's not. I don't think this is a terrible episode. It's not the strongest, but it's probably like second tier for me. I'm quite taken with this episode. Any final thoughts?
Well, I wish they would done sequels where Helen Foley uses her, pals around with her hallucinatory Marky and goes around solving murders.
That's Rod Serling's follow-up series. That'd have been amazing. Okay, but ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will join us on the next episode.